which you have a dam and a reservoir, or you can have runoff river systems in which you just take advantage of the natural flow of a river and so on. So, and locally, local generation actually historically has been anchored by hydropower with over 60 megawatts of installed local capacity. Bioenergy is one of the resources that is actually quite important. But the one that excites us more nowadays is not what we normally refer to as traditional biomass, but the modern versions of bioenergy, such as the energy that is used in some of our industries, like the sugar industry, where bagasse and wood chips are heavily used. And there is huge potential, actually, for bagasse and wood chips to supply maybe a large fraction of our base load. And there are actually even procurement processes going on in this area. But we're not limited to that, because there are liquid biofuels that can be used in transportation, and these can be made available also from some of these industries, as well as the use of waste in the generation of biogas. This could be something that maybe communities will find more interesting as a renewable energy resource. Wind energy, on the other hand, here, this is energy you were able to extract from flowing air or the kinetic energy of the wind. And predominantly here, you are looking at what we call onshore wind, where basically these are wind farms that are developed on land as well as offshore. Of course, as a country, offshore is out of our limit as a landlocked country, but onshore wind, there is some potential. It's just that the kind of studies that have been done are not at the level where one could then start developing large wind farms. But it's a resource that is available to us as a country locally. Geothermal energy, this is basically energy we are able to extract from the subsurface. And as a country, again, we might, some people, we do get excited about the fact that there are a few hot springs in certain parts of the country, but without any studies of the temperature profiles of those areas, then we do not know if we have any potential for geothermal energy in the country. And finally, ocean energy is also a renewable energy resource. Of course, as a country, we do not have access to this particular source of energy. But it is worth mentioning that if we are giving a presentation on renewable energy, then to complete the picture, we have to also highlight this one. And there are various technologies based on whether you are going to harness the energy from waves or from tides or from ocean currents. In some parts where maybe there are islands, this creates currents in which you can actually have systems that are generating electricity. So basically, these are the various forms of renewable energy resources that are being harnessed globally, and some are available, as I've indicated, locally, while the last two probably we shouldn't get too excited about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview. At least everyone in this room today is aware as to what renewable energy is. Won't make a mistake when you go out, because we really need to action. Can I request Gavin Mulu to make his presentation? We shall be asking questions from the panelists once we are done. Thanks so much.
Thank you. gentlemen, all protocols observed. Just wait. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me to give my to speak to you without my presentation. If I wave my hand and ask you to close your eyes, you might not get the picture of what I'm trying to say.
Any questions for the speaker that has given an overview on? Any questions from this? For the speaker that has given an overview for renewable energy in Eswatini as they work on the next presentation? Do we have a question from the floor? Okay. Seemingly, the presentation was clear as mud. So we. Okay, please press. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I did give this presentation yesterday, but at the launch of the EU Green transition. So, but I'll present it again. So it's really on the work that's been done through the GET.transform program here in Eswatini. So I was recently tasked with putting together a power system transformation assessment of the Eswatini energy landscape, and the report was released, and so there's some key findings from it, and now some actions that are going to come out of this report as well. So to start with, I'm just going to quickly speak about the GET.transform program and what it does and how it works, and I think that's very important. And then I'll get on to the actual findings of the power system transformation assessment report itself, so what we found from our assessment, and then our action plans going forward based on the findings of the report. So the GET.transform program is essentially, it's a technical assistance program, and it is operating in Latin America and in Africa. And it provides technical assistance in 4 key main areas. So the first area is your long-term energy planning. The second area is on-grid regulation and market development. Third area is off-grid regulation, market development. And the fourth area is your integration of variable renewable energy resources, so your VREs. Now, the way this is done is actually through different phases. So any energy market undergoes various phases in the transformation process. So the first thing and most important is to have the proper grid codes and compliance processes and policies and frameworks and regulations in place. So this is normally what we classify as phase 1 in the transformation, and the GET.transform program is actively assisting countries in developing strong grid codes and frameworks and policies around energy transformation. Then you get phase 2, where you get the first few renewable plants coming in, or your energy variable renewable energy sources coming into the system. So phase 2 is normally a very niche. You have 1 or 2 of these installations in, but it can very quickly progress into phase 3, where you actually have quite a large amount of variable renewable energy sources in your system. And you find at phase 3 now, the actual energy market is becoming dependent on these sources. By the time you get to phase 4, VREs are actually quite dominant in your market. So at this stage, there's a lot of activity around actually ensuring that if you're going to operate the system with these VREs in, there's sufficient stability in there, there's sufficient predictability in the systems. And then by phase 5, you've reached 100% penetration of your renewables in your system. So these are the different phases that the program uses, and it tries to assess where the country is and how the country can move through these phases in order to transform your energy market. So the Eswatini Power System Transformation Assessment, the way this was undertaken was we did a high-level summary, look at the energy market here in Eswatini. And it was done with using 3 main areas. The first area was we did a review of all the documentation. So there was we looked through all your regulations, all your policies, all your frameworks, all the presentations that were made over the years. It went through your Electricity Act, and then we essentially looked for any gaps that may exist in the actual policies and frameworks and stuff like that. The The second part was an interview phase. So we sat down with key stakeholders in the industry, and we asked them, what are your needs? What do you need? Where do you want to go? What are your problems? So the interview phase was very, very important, because whilst you have all these documentation, you also get a feel for what's on the ground, where people want to move, and stuff like that. And the third part is where we identified the gaps. So we took what the program can assist with, we identified the gaps, and we mapped this together. You'll see I've got this on another slide as well. And I think what's important to understand is this is not an in-depth analysis of the market, but it was a very high-level approach as to where the gaps exist in the transformation process. So the key stakeholders that we engaged with were the Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy, the regulator, ESERA, Eswatini Electricity Company, EEC. So these are the key public entities. We also engaged with private sector as well. And we're also well aware that there's key import partners that play a role in the Eswatini energy landscape as well, which is Eskom, Southern African Power Pool, as well as EDM, Mozambique. Now, what's very important to understand is that Eswatini as a country is not standing still. There's actually progress. The policies and frameworks are being developed. And this slide clearly shows it, that how the policies and frameworks are developing over time. So in order to accelerate the transformation, I said that the key driver and enabler is to have proper framework and policies in place. So you can see there is development of policies in place, the last one being the National Energy Efficiency Strategy released in 2019. So this is important that we understand that there are definitely frameworks in place in order for the transformation to take place. Now, I've got something in front, but this is the current market structure. So the current market structure is essentially, as it stands, where the EEC is predominantly handling the transaction of energy. But you also see there's a plan in place of where the market wants to move to. And this is very important, because when you understand where the market wants to go to, then you understand, you can then put in place the different actions that need to move the market to the end state. And this is what the program has now identified, and how to move this market structure so that we get to stage 3, where you can have cogeneration, where you can sell on an open market. So the 4 main areas that I identified earlier, within these 4 areas, we have some key topics that we normally look at. So these topics are normally, when we do the assessment, we try to map the needs to each of these different areas. So for example, in long-term energy planning, you'll see we have long-term energy system modeling. So if there's a need for long-term energy system modeling that we identify, then this will obviously mean the program can assist in this area. If you look at on-grid markets, we look at cost-reflective tariffs or distributed generation, off-grid markets, business modeling, financing models, and so for example, in the VRE, we would look at storage frameworks, for example. Now, these are the key areas that the GET.transform program has access to expertise with. When you map the needs of the country, so sitting with the key stakeholders, we identified key needs that they highlighted to us and through our assessment itself. And once you do this, you can then map these needs against the actual program, what the program can deliver as well. So for example, one of the requirements in long-term energy planning was to develop a short-term generation expansion plan. Because currently your energy master plan has been updated to 2050. And that's a 2050 foresight. You want to come to something a bit more shorter so you can get the energy on the ground quicker. If you look at, for example, VRE integration, the support of small-scale embedded generators in the market, and allowing small-scale embedded generators is a key need and driver of the industry as well. So taking the needs, we've actually identified key areas that the program can assist with. So the ones highlighted in green is what we're going to now kick off in terms of assistance through the program. The one in orange is actually already been executed, where we ran capacitation of ESERA and the ministry on market reform. Now, throughout all of this here, one very, very important thing stands out, is that capacity building is key to the transformation. So it's not about just coming in, doing the work, and leaving. It's about ensuring that there's capacity, and the capacity remains in Eswatini. So throughout all of these identified areas, capacity building is key to the entire transformation process as well. So with that in mind, we then look at where Eswatini is in terms of our 5 phases in the model. And you can see currently Eswatini is sitting somewhere between phase 1 and phase 2. You have policies and frameworks in place. You have your first set of renewables and generation coming into the market. So you're sitting somewhere between phase 1 and phase 2. And now it's about ensuring that the frameworks, policies, regulation is strengthened, so that so that you can move firmly into phase 2 itself. So how do we move into phase 2? Well, the next steps essentially that we've identified is that we've now constituted work group teams that we've set up with the key stakeholders, and we're going to actually now set up terms of references, so to frame exactly what is required. Once we get these terms of references set up, within the program itself, we refer to this as request for service. The GET.transform program has access to consultants with international expertise, and then based on that, these requests for services will be put out to these consultants. And once we identify suitably qualified consultants, they will be appointed so that they can come in and start executing projects and programs within the areas that we've identified. So that's, and the GET.transform program will actually contract and project manage them. So this, now you have an idea of the GET.transform program and how we're actively working here in Eswatini. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Given, for that presentation. At least we know now, as Eswatini, we need to move from the phase 1, phase 2, and move to phase 5. And indeed, capacity building with the assistance of EU will take us there. Over to you, Nolwazi, for your presentation on the Energy Master Plan. At least we'll be able to understand now as to how far have we gone as a country with regards to the maybe implementation of that master plan for energy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nolwazi Kumalo from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy. I'll be presenting on the Energy Master Plan. Our protocol is observed. In terms of the background on the Energy Master Plan, the exercise started in 2016, where the ministry was supported by the International Renewable Energy Agency, and they received support on long-term energy planning, which was a new topic in the country. The first Energy Master Plan was eventually launched in 2018. It was an exercise which took about 2 years, from 2016 to 2018. The Energy Master Plan is developed by a group of local experts from the ministry, from the utility, from the regulator, from the Central Statistical Office, as well as the University of Eswatini, in particular the Center for Sustainable Energy Research. Following the launch of the 2018 Master Plan, because long-term energy planning is an ongoing exercise, you cannot then just finish. We eventually started with the update of the 2034 Energy Master Plan. Mainly, we started with energy data collection. The update of the master plan is supported by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is also building on the capacity that was created by the IRENA. In this phase, we are also doing capacity building, and we are now using 2 additional models, which is the model for analysis of energy demand and the model for supply systems, and which particularly looks further into how the deployment of renewable energy is featured in the modeling exercise. So basically, an energy master plan for the country is a long-term plan that directs the expansion of the electricity supply until 2050 using a different set of optimization models, which considers technical constraints, economic constraints, which is basically the technology prices that are being considered, social constraints, as well as other externalities, such as the CO2 emission targets. Key policy objectives that are being looked at in the 2050 Energy Master Plan are anchored in the different policies which previous speakers have spoken about, which are in the country. So basically, the plan for the 2050 master plan is to go in line with the global net zero target by 2050. It is also to support the development of domestic resources, in particular to meet the 50% target of renewable energy in the electricity generation mix. It is also to provide all households with access to modern energy by 2030, and lastly to ensure a security of supply for the country by 2026, in particular a baseload generation capacity. So the methodology for the development of the Energy Master Plan, the planning horizon starts from 2018 to 2050. So basically 2018 is our base year that we start modeling. And then we look at how 2019 and 2020 it has to depict the actual cases that happen in the country. So for the energy demand, we are using the MAYET model, which I've spoken about. It looks into a given set of assumptions, such as your population growth rate, the electrification rate, as well as the GDP growth rate for the different sectors in the country. And then that exercise becomes then an input into the supply model, which is a message model. A message model is a list. It uses the MAYET as an input, and we have a set of supply technologies, which we take into account renewable energy technologies and all the other domestic resources that are in the country, as well as your imports. And then from there, we develop a set of scenarios, which I will speak about in my next slide. So this modeling approach does not only look at the electricity, but also considered non-power sectors, which is basically how they are used in the country. So basically, the model results that we get investment plans that are required, and we also get electricity production from the different technologies, the fuel use that would be required in order to meet the demand, electricity trade, as well as CO2 emissions. This is basically a mirror of what the reference case is for the 2050. So the reference case basically depicts how the current policies will look like if we maintain them up to the year 2050. I think what is particularly important, we note that we'll see hydro power generation to still be required in the country to meet the demand, as well as an increase of the biomass, which is basically informed by the different energy projects that are currently ongoing in the country, as well as solar. So basically, we start seeing the input of the wind and geothermal post-2028. So basically, the sets of constraints that are in this particular case, it's just the current policies, and the main driver is the prices of the different technologies that have been fed into the catalog of the model. Then in terms of scenarios, then we developed a number of scenarios. We have a number of core scenarios which are basically looking into if we were to reduce the import reliance in the country using the coal resources. And we also have two demand scenarios which are depicting two cases. In case we have a high demand in the country, how are we going to meet that demand? And we also have a low demand. A good example of a low demand was the COVID-19 year, where we experienced a decline in the consumption of energy resources. And then we also have a no import scenario, which is considering if the country, the imports by 2030, how will the technology requirements be? And we also have a number of domestic resources scenario, which is one, how are we going to meet the renewable energy 50% target, as well as 100% electricity target. And we also have an NDC scenario, which is basically considering the technologies in the short-term generation expansion plan with an addition of 80 megawatts of hydro generation. And further, last scenario, we have a natural gas scenario, which is also similar to the coal scenario. It explores if we're to reduce imports using natural gas resources. And then in terms of the comparison of the scenarios, For the 2025 year, the situation doesn't look like it will change. It will look like how it is at the moment. And then if you compare the 2030 year, if you start meeting the different targets, if you look at the course, you'll see that if you develop the 100 coal scenario, there will still be a need for hydro generation, biomass, wind, as well as the solar technologies. And then I think most of the scenarios basically, in terms of percentage and capacity technology choices, it basically looks and remains the same. But what is also noted is that when you are doing your renewable energy 100 scenario, you'll note that there'll be a need of solar with battery storage just for backup power. And then in terms of the average generation cost, you see that most of the scenarios, it's between $70 and $90. That's where the average price will be, only except for that, that high line, which is basically the natural gas scenario, which shows that using natural gas mainly as a source, it eliminates all the other technologies, and the costs are quite high, but mainly driven by the prices of the fuel, the natural gas fuel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nolwazi, for that presentation. At least we know how we've performed as a country with regards to the Energy Master Plan, and we're happy that it's going to be reviewed soon. Mandla, can you please come and give us an overview of the regulatory framework that we have in Eswatini, so that we can understand we want to make this green transition. Is the legal framework that we presently have as a country going to enhance that, or are we still going to have challenges? So as you make that presentation, I believe that will be answered as well.
Good morning, everyone. All protocol observed. I think mine is just to present a brief overview of the energy sector, as well as, like the moderator has stated, touch on the regulatory framework that guides the electricity sector in Eswatini. In terms of demand, Eswatini currently sits at about 233 megawatts, 80% of which is met through imports from Eskom and EDM, as well as the Southern African Power Pool. And we generate locally, mainly from renewables, where we have 60.4 megawatts from hydro owned by the utility, together with 10 megawatts of solar, also owned by the utility. We have about 105 megawatts generation from the co-generation companies, which is mainly used for own use. We have a little bit of coal from an ethanol producing plant. As well as mentioned earlier, we have private companies who have recognized that solar PV is becoming competitive to electricity, to grid electricity, hence the desire to invest. And this totals in excess of 15 megawatts. In terms of electricity access, we currently sit at 82%, and we are amongst one of the highest in Africa in terms of electrification. And that is divided into 94% for urban, as well as 72% for rural. This has been an increase from 5% in 2003 to 82% currently, which has been met mainly through grid extension. And this has been made possible by efforts from government as well as development partners such as the Republic of China and Taiwan. And to support grid extension, the government has established a rural electrification fund, which is administered by the ministry. And we have realized that in order to attain universal access in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to look at innovative ways of serving rural areas where it is becoming uneconomical for the utility to reach. Moving on to the regulatory framework, we have the Electricity Act, as mentioned by other speakers earlier, which provided for the reform and consolidation of laws that regulated the distribution and supply of electricity. And the Act also provided for the liberalization of the energy or electricity sector to allow for a transparent and fair process of procuring independent power producers. The Act also gave powers to the regulator to procure new generation capacity, which is done in consultation with the minister. And the Act also gave powers to the minister to make regulations that will provide an enabling environment which will allow serving the areas that we cannot reach with grid electricity. And then we have the Energy Regulatory Authority, which enacted Energy Regulatory Authority Act of 2007, which established the regulator, which administers the Electricity Act, and its key functions, as will be highlighted by my colleague from the regulator, is to process applications, prescribe conditions, as well as receive and investigate and adjudicate consumer complaints. And then we have the Electricity Company Act of 2007, which provided for the establishment of the utility, and this provide for the performance by the EEC of the powers and functions that were previously performed by the Swaziland Electricity Board, which are mainly generation, transmission, distribution, and supply of electricity. It is important to note at this point here that we are currently reviewing our legislation to align with or to restructure the electricity sector in order to align implementation of projects with planning. And then in terms of policy, the ministry developed an energy policy of 2018, which is based on 5 principles. Just to highlight a few, these are aimed to ensure security of electricity supply, efficient and cost-effective electricity supply, to provide all households with access to modern energy, and establish a national electricity fund that will support renewable energy and accelerate access to modern energy. We felt at this point we should highlight some of the key policy positions. The first one being that government seeks to ensure adequate security of electricity supply through constituting an adequate local generation capacity, including reserve, diversification of electrical power imports within the region, as well as establishing the National Electricity Master Plan, as presented by my colleague Nolwazi earlier. And then the next policy position, government speaks to government supporting the development of renewable energy sources for a target of 50% in the electricity generation mix through establishing the potential for the development of the different RE technologies, setting binding targets to be achieved by 2030, as implementing the identified RE projects within the short and medium term, as well as phase in net metering, as will be spoken to by the regulator, and most importantly, support investors in preparation of new bankable projects that will be able to access finance and through provision of incentives for the development of these projects. The next policy position is policy position 4, where government seeks to support a comprehensive development of national capacities in RE or renewable energy project preparation and implementation. This will be done through facilitation of awareness raising, as well as training and capacity building, for not only for officials, as well it supports capacity building for government officials, as well as the private sector and other stakeholders, in particular local banks and private developers, equipment suppliers, as well as service providers to ensure that the deployment of renewable energies is sustainable. And perhaps the last policy position speaks to government facilitating the access of independent power producers in the electricity market through an effective regulatory framework, through the development of codes and standards that will be spoken to in detail by the regulator, and maybe most importantly, through the moving of the sale of electricity from first schedule exempt goods and services to second schedule zero-rated goods and services, which enables IPPs to recoup money paid as VAT for importing electrical equipment, which had been identified as a barrier towards an increased deployment of renewables. We have also established an IPP policy, which also seeks to create an enabling environment to promote establishment of sustainable renewable energy generation that will benefit the economy through increased use of local renewable energy resources, as well as promoting deployment of IPP capacity to meet the country's needs to ensure energy security and self-sufficiency. Other policies we have established include the energy efficiency conservation policy, together with its strategy and action plan, which seeks to promote energy conservation within the energy sector in Eswatini, as well as ensure that demand-side management measures are taken into consideration to reduce demand on the electricity grid. I think I will not speak to the 2 slides as my colleague has already spoken to this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Mandla, for that overview on the legal framework that we have as Eswatini. Without waste of time, can we request Simpiwe from ISERA to come and give us his presentation? At least we'll understand what the role of the regulator is, how they are going to assist us in this transition. And we'll understand maybe we'll be penalized if we are not conforming, we're not achieving those targets that have been set in the master plan, or what happens. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Program Director, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. I think my presentation, to be honest, has mostly been covered by my colleagues. And I think I was going to essentially just highlight what the regulatory environment is currently looking like and what we are doing to move along and create this enabling environment to then promote, I think, achieve what government policy sets in terms of achieving 50% renewables by 2030. I think, as said, my colleagues has essentially covered most of what what I was going to present, including the ESERA mandate that my colleague from the government, from the ministry, spoke about, licensing, pricing, and I think perhaps also important is to mention that we also are currently doing power procurement, again, of renewables. We are running 2 tranches at the moment, which is 40 megawatts for solar and 40 megawatts for biomass. But I think essentially what is important, I think what we all realize is that as we move towards renewable energy, and also I think an important conversation that is currently going on in our industry is that of security of supply, is that this needs a lot of cooperation, it needs a lot of working together towards achieving these goals, and private sector that needs to play a significant role as we move towards security of supply, as well as we move towards cleaner energy resources So the ministry has set the tone in terms of policy, and what we as regulator, as the regulator then needs to do is to create this enabling environment in terms of putting the proper regulatory framework in place to then attract private investment and attract funding into the sector so that we move towards cleaner energy. So I think I'll speak to what we've done as regulator. Again, I think Jeevan has covered the market structure. I think he did a good job of that, so I'll pass that and go straight to what we've done and we are currently doing as regulator in terms of creating this enabling environment. I'll highlight the key regulatory frameworks that we are developing and have developed. One being a willing framework, which essentially allows third parties to use the grid owned by the utility to actually transport power from a generation plant to a load that is located in a different geographic location. We have been working on this, I think, since sometime late last year, and I can confirm that we have actually held stakeholder consultations on this before finalizing it, and we are at the very last stages of actually developing this framework, and it will be in place by the beginning of the coming year, which is I think about 2 months ago. So, so that's good news. In terms of small-scale embedded generation, the framework we've developed last year, we completed developing a framework, and this framework is essentially to set the rules of how generators that have installed capacity and want to feed back into the grid, how they will do that, and also addresses the tariffs, how those tariffs will be set in terms of compensating those generators that will actually generate electricity and send back to the grid. We have been working closely with stakeholders, specifically EEC, who is in the process of implementing this, and we have, I believe, some pilot sites where customers have already installed self-generation to then try out this framework and refine it before we can then roll it out to the rest of customers. We are at this moment just starting the pilot phase, and I'm sure next year the process of then rolling it out to other customers will then begin. Ring fencing guidelines, I highlight this because I think it's important for creating an enabling environment. So the ring fencing guidelines are essentially saying let's ring fence the particular licensed activities, even for the utility, which is traditionally has been a vertically integrated utility, so that the costs of each of the regulated entities can be transparent, so that they can be scrutinized better, so that comparisons between licensees in either in generation, transmission, or distribution can also be made easily to inform investors, potential investors, of what it costs in Eswatini specifically to then provide services in line with these regulated activities. And then the tariff methodology, I think, is a key instrument that we actually use in our function of determining tariffs in the country. And as the industry has moved along over the years, we've realized that it needs updating to align with what the current status of the industry is, and we're in the process of reviewing this. It's also taking into consideration the other frameworks that we've developed as well, so that all our frameworks are harmonized and aligned and actually inform, again, the market correctly. Our grid code, which initially was developed a few years back in 2014. Again, the industry has moved along, technology has moved along, and it needed to be updated. And we are in the process. We've just started a review of the grid code. I'll say the first phase of the review there will be a later phase, I think that will be funded by GIZ, to then add necessary codes, again, that are being necessitated by new technologies coming on board, and the need to coordinate this so that they work well together. And then lastly, to highlight that, again, the regulator has developed a mini-grid framework, and this is complete, and is actually an instrument that is now functional. And the reason for this is, again, as much as the country has achieved an 83% average access rates in terms of connections in Eswatini, there are areas, I think, that have been identified as areas that will specifically need mini-grids to actually to give access to electricity for those particular communities, and hopefully also develop some economies around there that have, I think, been stifled by the lack of access to energy. So we've developed this framework, and I think because of the uniqueness of mini-grids, it then takes into account several, I think, differentiating factors that wouldn't necessarily apply to the grid, to also encourage the uptake of mini-grids, again, by private investors coming into the space to actually contribute and fast-track the development of the energy sector and our move towards renewable energies. Ladies and gentlemen, so I think about 4 years ago, the African Development actually implemented an index, or rather launched an index called the Electricity Regulatory Index. And this index is essentially to help regulators and help countries assess the level of development of the regulatory environment in terms of the electricity, specifically the electricity industry, so that we can then identify gaps and improve on our regulatory environments, again, to promote investment and fast-track development of capacity, especially renewable capacity in the region. Eswatini has participated in this index since 2019, and the last index, actually, which was 2021, Eswatini was ranked 9th of 43 countries in Africa in terms of the development of the regulatory environment. And this index is essentially divided into 3 sub-indices. One, which is the regulatory government, which essentially assesses the level of the development of the legislation and regulatory instruments that are there in the sector. And I think we scored, Eswatini scores quite highly there. And the second one is regulatory substance, which says what are the processes that are in place to then implement legislation, to implement those regulatory instruments, and how effective are these processes. And I think there is some room for improvement. I think for the country there, we are actually going to develop a gap analysis to then identify specific areas of improvement. And then the last one is regulatory outcome, which essentially then looks at the licensed entities themselves and customers and stakeholders in the industry, and says how do they view regulation to be effective in the country. And again, there's room for improvement there, which again will be addressed as we identify those gaps that need to be closed there. But overall, I think we have done have done well as a country, but obviously we need to improve. The landscape is changing, technologies are changing, and I think I can highlight again that the regulator is working towards developing further regulatory instruments for storage, which is, I think, is a key enabler as we move to renewable energies due to the nature of some of the renewable energies technologies we have. We are looking at developing frameworks for electric vehicles, for example, which we recognize that the world is moving towards, again, that direction, and we need to be prepared with the proper regulatory frameworks so that they don't become a stumbling block as the world and the country, in fact, move in this direction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Simpiwe. Can we invite our last speaker for this session, Nosipho from EEC, to give us an overview on embedded generation roadmap. Over to you, Nosipho. Yeah, you must understand you are between our breakfast and, yeah. So, but we really want to hear what you want to tell us about that.
Okay, I'll try. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocol observed. So Constance said her job is to introduce speakers, and my job is to talk about embedded generation and small-scale embedded generation in Eswatini. And your job is to ask questions at the end of the session. So my presentation will briefly just go through the definitions of embedded generation, and then I'll give an example of what embedded generation is and the status of adoption in Eswatini. And then I'll talk about the institutional readiness and operational readiness and staff readiness of the project, as well as the roadmap. So, to just get definitions out of the way, embedded generation, an embedded generator is a generating unit that is embedded in the distribution network. So mostly the customer introduces or constructs an embedded generator for their own use. And then while small-scale embedded generators on the other end are embedded generators that are less than 1 MVA. So we define them according to size. And as well as embedded generators that are connected to the MVW, so which means they're connected on the 11 kV network. They are no longer called small-scale embedded generators, they're just called embedded generators because different criteria apply to them when we look at them and allow them onto our grid. So the popular technologies at the moment that we are seeing on our grid are solar PV and hydro. But you do have your biomass and your gas turbines as well as diesel. We can also call them embedded generators. So these systems are called grid-tied because they cannot work when the grid or the network is off. So they look at the system frequency and the voltages. And once those two elements are not present, the embedded generator switches off. Okay. There's something missing here. We have an overview. Our screen is blank. I don't know. But I wanted to explain what an embedded generator. I'm not sure, where is Julia? We have a diagram missing here just to explain, maybe for those who are not technically. It's not here. Okay. Maybe we can move along. Otherwise, I wanted to explain what is this. So you have your solar PV panels, and then you have an inverter. So the solar PV panels generating direct current, and then the inverter converts the direct current to alternating current. And so in between the inverter, you have your installation, so you have your household, and then you have the grid that the inverter synchronizes too. So we have, so the big guy is the inverter there. We need to specify how it has to align to certain standards. So moving along to talk about embedded system status in Eswatini. So in recent years, we've seen a proliferation of these systems. And I think the first ones were observed in 2018, so that is capacity in megawatts DC. And I think most of, some of it was in the Lubombo region because I've worked in distribution. So we saw one in Tamboti. And then in 2019, we had 0.6. So these are figures that we've also got from the regulator. And then in 2020, we had 8.7 megawatts DC. And this in total, this far, is 17 megawatts, which represents about 7% of our national demand. In as much as we have been seeing this proliferation, but these systems were not regulated, and therefore they pose technical challenges onto our network in terms of voltage violations and safety of our personnel and the environment. So after that, ISERA then developed, I think Simpiwe talked about it, ISERA developed a small-scale embedded generation framework that gives just guidelines on how we are going to regulate these systems. And then a task team was selected to operationalize this framework. Okay, so in this framework, so 6 sites were identified to actually try to develop systems or see what is on the ground. So we went to sites like Canterbury, which is around 335 megawatts, or rather kilowatt peak. And then also went to Tabangulu, I think it's 1,325 kilowatt peak. It's one of the biggest, just to see what is on the ground. And then after that, we tried to be operationally ready to embrace these embedded generators. So we developed processes, we developed documents, and as well as requirements for customers who want to register their systems or have their systems given permission to connect onto the grid. And then after that, we had like a stakeholder engagement internally, because embedded generation actually has come to turn the utility literally on its head. Before we were before in generation, like you have electrons flowing from our main power stations. And now you have electrons flowing from all over the place, from downstream. So we needed to have all stakeholders internally, from legal to look at the documents that we have set, to IT, to billing, because we need to have bidirectional meters that now measure the imported energy, the energy that the customer draws, and the energy that the customer exports during their excess, when they have excess generation. So we also had to have systems alignment, because it involves, embedded generation involves customer services, because the customer has to come and apply. It also involves system planning in terms of conducting grid impact network studies, because obviously when you install a generator onto the system, it will impact the network in one way or the other, either in voltages or power factor. So just also affecting the quality of the network. And then we started the pilot project just to test the systems that we have developed and processes that we have developed, test them on a small group of customers. I think it's about 6. And then after that, we plan on rolling out on the grid. So these were the one, this is one of the installations that is there. It's Canterbury, 335 kilowatt peak. And then this is Tawangul, one of the largest. And then, so just for everyone's appreciation, now we have a process to actually connect a customer on the grid. So the customer visits the website and completes application forms. And then they only they have to install a generator once we give them permission, because we need to assess on how that embedded generator will affect our network. And then if all the checks and balances are approved, then the customer can commission their site. We conduct an installation inspection, and then we issue an approval, and then the customer can generate. So this is just for your appreciation on how we are conducting this. And then on our website, we have uploaded this requirements document. So it tells you on what type of generator is allowed and what not is allowed. And then it also explains the application process should a customer want to install their own embedded generator. And also that applies to all the generators. That will also apply in retrospect, because we need to know how many generators are there on the system, how are they impacting our network, and we also need to ensure the safety of our personnel, because you can imagine you have an EEC worker switching off a system, and if we don't know if there's a generator downstream, what can happen. So we need to ensure that we know on what areas where there are generators on our system to ensure worker safety. So we have an application form. This can also be found on our website. We launched it yesterday with our pilot customers. And then these are the stakeholders. I think I explained that before, that these are all the people in the key chain in terms of the utility that play a role in actually having an embedded generator on the network. So this is my final slide. It just summarizes and also just gives the next steps on what has happened. So here, the framework, or rather, yes, the framework was then issued. In fact, it was issued, I think, in 2021. And then a task team was selected to operationalize the framework. And the team then visited some pilot sites, and that took about 3 months. And at this stage, the team knew nothing about embedded generation. Nothing, like I mean nothing. So we had to start to wrap our heads around embedded generation. And then once we got an idea, we had to operationalize or get operationally ready to establish, and by establishing embedded generation application processes and forms. So that began in May. And then right now our processes are now on CRM, the customer relationship management process, which means once the customer applies, anyone around the country can see that application on the system. And then we got working documents in July, and then started capacity building. So some of these steps went hand in hand. So just training, getting staff ready to process applications, getting our billing ready, and also getting the people who are processing the applications ready as well. And then we had stakeholder engagement, so which meant we had to have user acceptance testing of the systems in order to allow these embedded generators on the system. And then what is currently happening right now is the pilot project implementation. So we're conducting trials, we are reviewing the processes along with the customers that have been selected. And we expect this process to take at least 6 to 9 months because there'll be lessons learned along the way, and we need to review and refine our processes. And then we plan to conduct a national rollout. In fact, we want customers to start registering in January because we need to know how many generators are there and how much capacity is on the grid. Because it's not only the customers that have applied with the regulator that we know of. There are many more installations that I think I've seen around that are not listed on the regulator list. So that is just the long and short of the embedded generation and SSEG roadmap. We are still learning, we are still in a process of refining our systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, great panelists. Thank you, Nosipho, for that presentation on embedded generation. Indeed, we are all learning today. I'm sure maybe some of you knew about it. We are supposed to go for breakfast now. It is ready. Can we go? And we are allowing 15 minutes so that when we come back, we have just a maybe 5-minute session for questions. We said it shall be an interactive session, so can we please go and have, if you're not having something to eat, just stretch, because we're still going to go a long way. Thank you so much for your participation thus far. Thank you, great panelists. Let's clap for them as we move towards breakfast.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, time standing, yes, yes. Yeah, time standing, time standing, standing time.
Ahead with the question. The panelists will respond. They are back.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alex Ngumalo. I write for the Time Sunday as a columnist. I'm a layman in this whole phenomena, but a very interested, layman and a very smart one. Okay, my first question, it will involve all the panelists. What took us, so long to realize the benefits of renewable energy? And then number two, what have been or are the challenges? Especially, I'll refer this one to GET.transform. In terms of the political will, because we always know that in Swaziland, there's no hurry in Swaziland, I think, yeah. The political will, as we know, with all governments, where, money or funds are involved, they always drag their feet. Okay, what's been your challenges on that aspect? And then, with our reliance on South Africa, I'm deeply worried because of the changing and volatile, what you call, political situation. And so far, we've been very lucky because we import a lot from South Africa, and they are under an onslaught of load shedding. But it's very funny how we, countries like Swaziland, we haven't been affected, yet we import so much from South Africa. I'd like an answer on that. And then my final question, I'll be brief. According to, okay, we are making grand plans. Okay, I had one of the slides we're talking about 2050. What guarantee do we have? Okay, I'll say that in jest. Will the world will the world be still in existence in 2015? In 2050. And then your predictions, do you envisage a future where we will not be entirely dependent on importing electricity, a future where we will experience a total eradication of sources of energy that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? And then in all these plans, this is vital. How are you planning to involve the ordinary ordinary man on the street? Because most of the time you make grand plans without involving us, grassroots people. And then when you've made all those grand plans, you sort of come and impose those decisions on the grassroots people. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I request Simpiwe and Nolwazi to respond? And I'm sure we also have people who are not part of the panelists, but who can also assist on this one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think these are very important questions, I think, that are being raised. And most of them are actually, I think, speaking to security of supply in while we transition also, I think, to renewable energy. So I'll try and respond and sum them up in one answer. So first of all, I think the first question was what took so long, and I think transitions need a lot of collaboration of different stakeholders in not just in the country, but also other partners regionally and internationally and so forth. And you need to have infrastructure in place. And when I say infrastructure in place, it is not just, I'm not talking about physical infrastructure, but rather what is normally referred to as soft infrastructure. So when we transition to any sort of structure or adoption of certain technologies, we then need policy to first set the tone for stakeholders to then move towards a particular direction. And also we then need to operationalize what the policy direction is. And therefore, what you are seeing, when we presented earlier, you're seeing regulatory instruments then being developed. And I think it mustn't stop there. We must then move to actually operationalizing those regulatory instruments. Again, I think as I said earlier, you then create this enabling environment that then invites other stakeholders to also participate in taking advantage of these technologies that are greener, more sustainable in actually addressing our energy problems. So I think this is why it then takes time, but I think the good thing is we are moving. I was happy to see that even the developed regulatory instruments are actually being implemented as presented by EEC. And that's an important step, I think, that typically gets overlooked, having these policies and instruments and regulatory instruments in place. But then the question is, are you now implementing so that you actually deliver on what the policy intended to do? So in terms of security of supply, I think the most interesting question that I picked up was, do we see ourselves being independent of other sources of power from the region, and do we see ourselves completely going renewable? I honestly believe this is possible, but I think when we do address this issue of independence, we need to be careful. The old saying of don't put all your eggs in one basket. When we speak of security of supply, we should also speak of diversity of supply, right? So, and we also speak of regional integration. So as we look at developing local generation, we should also look at sourcing from the region. I think as a region, we'll probably find these solutions much quicker. We'll probably have more sustainable solutions. So I think as we address security of supply, we shouldn't isolate ourselves from the rest of the region. So we should diversify our supply, and I think that's the best solution in terms of security of supply and actually going totally renewable, is that we'll need to work together as a region. So I do honestly think we'll get there. EEC, in fact, I think has reduced to some extent imports from Eskom, and I think that sort of addresses your other question that we are not getting load shedding because the utility has actually diversified a supply to look at the rest of the region, the Southern African power pool, to look at other countries like Mozambique to import power, and that has then maintained our supply to this point being stable. So I think that highlights my earlier point that we need to diversify
our supply and work together as a region to find the solution. Yeah, I think, I hope I've answered most of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simpiwe, for that answer. Can we request the next person to ask their question?
Thank you very much. Sandy Lemabuza from Wella Capital. I think I want to keep it short. There was mention, first of all, the observation that I made in terms of the energy mix. I don't see nuclear being an option or being considered, nuclear power. For some argument, it is considered clean energy, unless you get to the waste stage. Would Swaziland not consider nuclear as an option, and why? Secondly, there was mention also of funds being managed or being allocated by government. Can we have specific numbers so that we understand what the commitment by government is? Normally, government invests and business tries to match or do better than government. To understand the partnership, how much has been allocated to the two funds that were mentioned by the speakers? I think the one was the Rural Electrification Fund. The other one was the Renewable Electricity Fund. I didn't get that incorrectly, yeah. But can we just get specific numbers on those so that the businesses, the banks, and all involved in the financial sector can understand what commitment the government has put down on the table? Thank you.
I can
Thank you. Oh, you want to respond? Or you have a question?
I want to respond to the nuclear question.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I will not
Nuclear
respond to
and
that.
hydrogen as well, if you can do both. Thank you.
Okay, I will start with the nuclear. The first problem you encounter with nuclear is that it requires, for you to be profitable in doing it, you need to have very large systems, gigawatt level systems. Our national demand, I think it's been highlighted, is around 240 megawatts. And actually, of that, around 110 megawatts is actually base load, and nuclear is used for base load. So if we were to develop a nuclear power plant, that's one of the challenges you'll face. But also you'll face other challenges technically in terms of a large water body being required and other requirements for a nuclear power plant. So as a country, we are not therefore in a position to go in that direction. Hydro, on the other end, water is a scarce resource because hydro is heavily dependent on your river flows. So if you start analyzing the 5 main rivers in the country and you start thinking how much hydro can you really deploy, you also have to think about the agricultural activities that are also important. So you can't just build reservoirs and continually 24/7 just generate electricity with those reservoirs, because these rivers are also shared with our neighboring countries as well, so there are also those issues.
Okay. Can we get someone maybe from the ministry to respond?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I think I will try and address the question in 2 parts. The first one is with regard to how much government has committed with regard to electrifying the country. When we started the rural electrification program back in 2003, 2004, government has actually, back then government was driving the initiative. And then we then received support from the Republic of China, from other partners, including the Republic of China and Taiwan, which has been very instrumental in assisting us to attain the targets that we already have. And they were providing, when they actually started intensifying their support, they were providing about $3 million per annum towards that project. We also, towards 2014, 2015, we also saw government increasing the support towards rural electrification, where micro projects was very key. And in that project, I think we were not spending not less than 100 million per annum towards that project, which actually resulted to the increase of electrification in the country. Now, I think, as you are all aware, that government has, in collaboration with other stakeholders, government has actually implemented the deduction of the electricity levy from every consumer, which is aimed at supporting the electrification program and other programs that are related to that project. So currently, government is deducting 2.5% on each tariff consumed, which goes towards supporting that fund and also the project. So right now, in terms of other support, the electrification project that we have is mainly supported by the fund, which is mainly us as consumers. We also have a grant support that we have received from other partners, including the World Bank, which is also aiming at increasing the electrification rates in the country. I can end here for now, Chair. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Twala. I hope your questions have been answered. Can we proceed to the next session? Can I request the panelists for the next session and the moderator to come up front? And maybe whilst they are doing that, maybe we can get one last question. Someone who is watching virtually, participating virtually, is directing a question to one. Meanwhile, can the moderator and the panelists come up front? They want to understand if the projections that were being made by Nolwazi, are they taking into considerations the skills that we have in the country on renewables? The projections that we were making on the Energy Master Plan. Otherwise, thank you so much. Over to you, Mr. Saktolo.
Thank you very much. My name is Thabo Sakolo. I come from Esepak. So I will be taking the easy part of this session. You will notice on your program that it's myself and my colleague, Mangaliso Mohammed, who will be doing the difficult part of giving us the summary and the way forward from this part. And you might be asking yourself how I got him to do that. It's simple. I just bullied him to take the difficult part. So that's it. So with that, you will remember yesterday that we started this discussion with a few of my panelists. Today we are already here. And I promised yesterday that we will be continuing and having a Q&A and diving deeper into those discussions today, and that is the time. I am willing to keep that promise, but we have a bit of a glitch. Constance stole my time. She asked for it, I should say, and she wasn't expecting me to say no. So I said yes. But yes, we have a challenge now, which we will be managing with my panelists in terms of making sure that we still don't dig, we don't dig a little bit deeper into your lunch. Without further ado, I think I would first like to recap briefly what we spoke about yesterday. Mr. Moodley from GIZ did mention explicitly that they are not here to provide prescriptions, but they are here to provide advice. That tells me that we need to roll up our sleeves. As a Maswati, we should be ready to get our hands dirty. We cannot have them doing the things that we need to do for us. So, and at the same time, the ministry, represented by the Director, Energy, did mention that the sector is marked with complexity, which she described as a lot of moving parts and some kind of a moving target, which means that we cannot have it easy. we should brace ourselves for a bit of a tough task ahead, so that we will be able to get to where we want to get. But also the energy regulator did mention that with the support that they are getting from this initiative, the green power transformation, we are getting the capacity building that we need, which means now they will be able to shift and direct the sector in the desired direction. We also had the MD from EEC assuring us that there are efforts aimed at making sure that the small-scale embedded power generation are underway, which will then give us the diversity and the stability that we need. And finally, the CEO of Eswatini did assure us that the kind of private sector that we have is the kind that has a heart, and I guess that's a rare breed. So today we are beginning from that, and we are also diving deeper, as I've already mentioned. And I had hoped that I would have the opportunity to call my panelists, but the program director did that honors for me. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to check a roll call now that everybody is on board. So, but I think since I know all my panelists, they are here. We will just shoot right straight into it. You will see that your program, you were saying that there will be director energy, but then I think the person who was mixing these panelists wanted to go all the way in terms of the gender balance, to say let's just have only the gents. Yesterday we at least had one lady, but today it's a gents club. So let's see how the gents are handling it. So if I may start with you, Mr. Twala, the Senior Energy Officer in the Ministry of Natural Resources. So we'll be continuing from yesterday. We note that moving towards the green energy, and the GIZ indicate that we can really be ambitious and aim for 100% green energy in Eswatini, and the representative Babesimpiwe has just confirmed that it's possible to go all the way 100% green energy. So how do we get away from the trap of being stuck in perpetual planning and in the expense of action on the ground? Because when it comes to planning, we easily get into a point of being perfectionist at the expense of actual implementation. So my question is, how can we, as an economy, get out of that trap or potential trap of perpetually planning at the expense of implementation, and how can we involve industry or business in our planning? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. As introduced by the moderator, maybe I needed that magic. This one is... 1, 2. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm sitting with the big guns here. You may never know. And I'm a small fish, you know. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's a very, very important question. I think the director yesterday and also the minister, the honorable minister, I think they touched on a very critical subject. And they mentioned that the energy sector is very dynamic in terms of the developments that are taking place in the sector. So we have seen yesterday we had the utility being the regulator, playing the regulatory role, as well as the being the utility supplying electricity and distribution and generation, transmission and distribution in the country. Today, looking at what has been happening, we now have interest from independent power producers. We have players that want to come in from the demand side as well, We have the ESCOs that are becoming very, very common these days. So I think it is very important. The question that you are raising, it is very important that we continue planning. So in as much as we don't want to find ourselves with very good plans, we want to see implementation on the ground. I want to emphasize that it is very important for the country to have a continuous planning program, because that is going to inform us. I think the director mentioned that the dynamic transformation that we are seeing in the sector, if we do not plan ourselves, because what we need as a country is that in response to this transformation that we are experiencing, we need to make sure that we are ahead in our game. So that's where plans comes in. But that does not mean that we should continue planning. We need to make sure that there is some implementation on the ground that we want to see. And I think another issue, the plans that the planning that we are talking about, we need planning that is going to support our policy. So we need to make sure that the planning is there, is put in place, so that the policies that we have designed as a country are implemented, and we are seeing good results at the end of the day. Monitoring and evaluation of the plans that we have, I think that is very important. That is what is going to inform us in terms of the progress on the plans that we have committed ourselves to. I think, moderator, I think it's also important to mention that implementation of projects requires a clear and a strong political will. I think it was mentioned by the gentleman over there when posing a question that I think the political will aspect is very, very important. So whatever plans that we have, we need to make sure that there is a political will, and that will ensure that there is support that is needed in order to see those plans come to fruition. So we need to enable the environment. We need to de-risk investments. And what do we need to do? We need clear policies. We need clear strategies. We need plans. We need quantifiable targets. We need to make sure that the strategies that we have are there to ensure that we have a clear roadmap in terms of what we want to achieve as a country. Now, the question is, government has played its role, or it's playing its role in terms of planning. Government alone cannot achieve all these plans that we have. We cannot come up with these plans and come up with targets that are actually what we want to see as a country achieve at the end of the day. So we need public-private sector coordination. For us, what is important is that we cannot, right now, as I've mentioned, that we have seen a high rise of independent power producers, and there is so much interest. So government cannot be the planner as well, and again be the producer. For instance, I'll make an example. So we need to see a private sector play its role in terms of meeting the plans. So it does not mean that we'll only plan and then the private sector comes in to help us realize the plans that we've put in place. I think what is important is that the coordination between the public sector and the private sector should actually move together, from the planning aspect, from the policy development aspect, legislation development, up to the point where we now realize the development of projects, of which the private sector can play a very critical role. I think another last issue, I think on this one, moderator, I think for so many years we've seen so many piloting of projects and all the like. I think it is high time now I think we've piloted the technologies. We've seen the technologies are there. I think we have reached a point where now we should actually roll out projects so that we can implement the plans and targets that we have. In terms of involvement of the industry, the private sector, I think that, as I've mentioned, that we need to involve the private sector from the policy development up to the point where we now have targets and we are able to do monitoring and evaluation. I thank you. I submit, moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Babetwala, for that. And I like the way government automatically or organically mentioned that we want to put private sector as at the forefront to drive the development initiative. And this started as early as 2018 or even before that, but the prominence of that stance became more visible around 2018. So I'm happy if even today we are still repeating that and affirming that we want to put the private sector at the forefront. So I think now we can turn to the energy regulator, represented by Mr. Skhumbuzo Tabete, the CEO. So yesterday we did mention that we are getting support from this initiative, GIZ and partners, in terms of making sure that we have the skills that we want. So what I'm trying to figure out today is just to have a sense. We are getting the skill, but how far are we from getting enough? I know there's nothing like getting enough, but how far are we from bridging the skills gap to a point where we would say now we are happy, we can implement what we need to implement, especially the things that aligns with the green power transformation. But also, can we expect everybody, every private sector, to partake in the supply of power to the grid? And maybe lastly, can we expect the price or the tariff to be different for different renewable power technologies? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Program Director, and all protocol observed. I think 3 questions are actually coming up. When is enough of training or capacity building? The truth of the matter is it is never enough. I say this on the premise that the energy industry is extremely dynamic. You come back 2 years down the line, the situation has completely changed. When will it be enough, however, for us to put in practice all these frameworks? I think a classical example has been presented today. We were speaking of the SSCG framework that we have done. And I think if there's anything that is worth celebrating today and is in this event is Nozipo's presentation, when she indicated ably that we have 6 pilot sites, where I think what we were speaking to yesterday, that you now have a situation where a consumer will push power into the grid in Eswatini. A couple of weeks ago, I think we met all the regional regulators. Very few countries have attained the stage where we are. So we certainly want to think that it is a result of these forms of training. I think we are not very shy of trying to test these on a pilot project, giving them distinct or very clear timelines. And I think partly we owe it to EEC's willingness to understand that the landscape is completely changing. Money tends to flow best where its owner will realize better returns. So without that understanding, any form of resistance wouldn't help the country. I honestly think, in answering your question, therefore, yes, training will have to continue but respond to the changes in the dynamic energy industry. But certainly, I think when we plan our training, we also close it with certain results. There must be outcomes, because any poorly planned training will not have an element of project closure. I think that is just one thing. The second question was participation, I think, of the private sector, its freedom and latitude to participate in the industry. One of the most liberal pieces of legislation, I think, you will ever see for regulators is the one we have. The good thing about formulation of this legislation is that it was formulated when no one knew anything about it. So therefore, it was modeled around the most ideal and most liberal legislations in regulation. One of the classical provisions of the legislations is that even board meetings must be held and open to the public. It guarantees transparency. I'm just making a classical example if you read closely to the type of legislation that we have. And when you match it or you compare it with other countries, you find that it is that open. One of the provisions of the legislations, therefore, when it speaks to to private sector participation, I think one of the things is that it basically provides that if you want to generate power for own use typically, the regulator, unless there's a sound reason to say no, we will grant it. In other jurisdictions, this does not necessarily happen. Now, yes, in terms of participation of private sector into IPPs, I think the bottom line is that this is obviously regulated and provided for in the Act in terms of procurement of new generation capacity. I think the various tranches of procurement of energies have been very open. We've generally followed the standard model. I think at the end of the day, the freedom to participate is as open as it can be. Lastly, because without touching at the other issues we discussed yesterday, I think you touch on a very sensitive issue on the issue of pricing and tariffs when it comes to the average unit price of renewables. I think it's a very difficult one to give here. I think, I believe there's been a clear demonstration of options of where you can source various types of renewables. The answer again is that it actually depends. The price of solar over the years has been coming down significantly. What you are beginning to see, I think as one speaker mentioned, is that the unit price of solar is going to get lower and lower and lower. These are the international projections. So there are massive opportunities. But there are other forms of renewables which are extremely capital intensive. Therefore, they require higher investments. And if they are driven by IPPs, they are most likely to attract higher tariffs, as it were. So there is no blanket answer, but as a general observation, you normally find that renewables, depending on the source of energy, they do tend to be a little pricey. But others are cheaper, like solar is going to be a lot more cheaper. Hydro is a lot more cheaper. So if you rank them, you'd find that biomass is slightly more expensive because it is pretty much involved, because it has to be collected. There are issues of transport. It may not be centrally located, etc. So therefore, I think when you invest in that space, you must be extremely mindful that there could be a slightly higher tariffs. What we have seen happening, though, in other jurisdictions is that these average renewable tariffs have been ring-fenced. So you have a different tariff for a renewable. And there are many reasons to go into that space. We are not there yet, but it is part of the area of capacity building that we are going to be looking into on what will best suit the position of this country, obviously working with the stakeholders. I submit.
Thank you very much, CEO. That is very comforting, because it's, we are quick when we are faced with difficult situations to say the average will solve the problem, only to find that it kills those below the average and then works for the ones above. But I'm happy to note, to learn from you that the regulator has got that figured out so that we are able to adapt in this otherwise complex environment. And I think at this point I can turn to the MD at EEC, Mr. Ernest Mkonda. You did mention, MD, yesterday that you acknowledge, or is acknowledge the fact that change is inevitable, and you further reassured us that the company does embrace change. So what I want to figure out today, it's on the fact that we are so concerned about the issues of stability, especially of intermittent power sources like solar. So what are the key issues that IPP needs to be aware of as they prepare to be part of this small-scale embedded power generation? And the second question that I would like you to discuss is, how will the green power transformation impact EEC business model, and can we expect to see electricity becoming more affordable with an increase in embedded small-scale power generation? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Program Director. Very good questions indeed. First of all, if you look at your whole distribution of electricity, you need to make sure that there is stability on all the parameters that are required for the customer to be able to use the electricity meaningful. Now, the introduction of intermittent power systems, it means that we need to invest more on systems that will stabilize the grid and also make sure that we have sufficient base load to make sure that it covers the times when the intermittent sources are not available. Because the nature of electricity is that it will always be required by the load, irrespective of where it comes from. Now, the challenge for the EEC again is that we need to make sure as well that those renewable energy systems that are installed at the independent power producers are functioning. Therefore, we need to make sure that the grid is present at all times. Because, as you might know, they tether on the grid frequency, without which they don't generate. Now, the EEC then means that it will have a challenge in making sure that system planning as well as operational planning is adequate to make sure that there is no independent power producer that is disadvantaged. Now, in terms of the impact on the business model for the EEC, if you look at the current model, EEC imports most of the electricity that it supplies to the customer. The spread is 80-20. And most of the time, the 20% that we produce is produced during the peak times, with the exception of the unbatchable plant at Lavumisa, which is an intermittent source of supply. Now, that means, therefore, that in terms of the financial model, there is not much that is going to change, because we will be changing sources of supply rather than investing on our own generation plant, which would have an impact on the business model, because then with that you get more operation and maintenance cost. And if it is a biomass plant, you have cost of feedstock as well, and also the transport related to that. But in terms of the operational regime as EEC, what we have observed in other jurisdictions where you have multiple sources of supply, the priority is on the cheapest source of supply, but most reliable as well, so that you dilute the tariff that goes to the final consumer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MD. That was comforting. And it sounds to me like we are in sync in terms of the direction that we are taking and the consideration for the different power sources and the related cost. And I'm a bit encouraged by the fact that the switch is not going to affect the business model significantly, because at the end of the day, we do acknowledge the fact that we need the power utility, we need EEC, and we wouldn't like to see the change if it will drastically affect the EEC model. And yeah, that's very encouraging. And I think at this point I can turn to the CEO, Business Eswatini. Yesterday, CEO, you did touch on a very interesting aspect, the aspect that business can be clients to EEC, but at the same time, they can be suppliers of energy to EEC. So from your point of view, do you appreciate that there is a role regulation ensures, regulation to ensure that this happens in a fair and balanced manner? And another question is, how do you exercise patience? I know patience is not what we have in private sector, but forgive me, I'm not a private sector person, I'll ask that anyway. So how do you exercise patience while regulators and the ministry sets rules and of engagement, and how to bring the private sector on board to move along with government objectives to achieve the required transformation?
Thank you very much, Moderator. First of all, because we are part organizers, please allow me just to acknowledge the excellence we are absent, and also GIC representative Thomas Chef was here, but also my president, BE president, Andrew Larue is here, albeit representing Montigny today. We apply our work under his leadership. Certainly thank you, Andrew. And also my colleagues also who are here, and also those besides me. I have to be careful what I say today. I think yesterday I was saying everything which is reckless, abandon, unaware of the potential cost of that. But today, I think I'm very, very cautious what I'm going to say. But before I just delve into that question, there is something which maybe I just need to raise for all of us to appreciate. One of which is, do you all see the jobs, the high quality jobs that will be created by our migration to renewables? I think please do not be oblivious of the major benefit of doing so, because it's like creating a brand new industry that will take in so many graduates. And also, I just want to touch on this because no one has touched on it, and I think it's so crucial that we talk about it. Are you aware of our tariff structure currently that is based on cross subsidies? Yes, it is. You have the private sector subsidizing consumers. No, domestic consumers, of which I'm a part, of which I'm a beneficiary, by the way. But businesses are subsidizing that, and sometimes up to 40%, just in case. And I'm sure you are also frustrated and say, you've heard yesterday and today, speak after speaker. They are all of them hitting the right notes, and you asking yourself, how come one not moving fast enough? And indeed, the question is, you move fast enough, what happens? Because whilst you are dealing with a climate issue, and it's the right thing to do, because like I said yesterday, government nailed their colors to the mast on COP26, reduction of over 1 million greenhouse gases by 2030. They nailed their colors to the mast. They're going to do that, and we have to. And together, they did say renewable energy will be the model to adopt, and also the partnership with the private sector. And I'm very, very happy to hear speaker after speaker say, you know, in partnership with the private sector here, and my colleagues around this table, I trust them because I've worked with them. But everybody is saying that partnership with private sector. And next thing I see people just running without us. It happens. But they're just not here, the ones who do that. I don't see any of them here, unfortunately. But I think some of them were here yesterday. I'm not quite sure. Because it's fashionable to do so. You know, in conjunction with the private sector, we will do this. But next thing, they are gone. And here we are complaining behind. The subsidies, 40%, is if we were all to migrate today. Tell me, what happens to the domestic consumers? If any one of you has that kind of wisdom today, because if we can address that issue, I have got a feeling. I've got a feeling. I think there's a song titled, I've got a feeling, I've got a feeling. But I've got a feeling that we could move expeditiously to this. But the problem is 40% subsidies. What do you do with that? And I hereby, it's not a rhetorical question, I'm posing to you just in case, and I see quite a lot of people with the wisdom that I don't have, to say, I think I have a solution to that. If you can crack that, I can guarantee you that beginning very shortly, the IPPs who've put forward great projects. The funding is there. People are ready to go, but somehow it's like something is pulling them back. And I can tell you now confidently that part of that's pulling them back is the subsidies. And also, we have to appreciate, and I'm not just saying this to ameliorate you, EC CEO, I'm saying because I can appreciate as a Swazi the good intentions of having done that. You have to be cold-blooded if you don't appreciate why it was done. The intentions were extremely good. But then the road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it? Yes, it's paved with good intentions. And here we are. If we can address that issue together, then I think we can crack that. I'm not totally unmindful of the time that we have. And I'm also aware that this evening I'm coming back here. So I don't want to unload everything. And part of the question that you've raised, would you be so kind as to allow me to do so in the evening for the sake of time? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngozi, for that. I think I got a better version of you that is mindful of time. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that. And then I think now we can, but before we move, I want to make a very small comment on what you said about private sector being reliable. I've got a very rare opportunity to work with the president, CEO Montigny. You will take it as it is. If he doesn't like it, he doesn't like it. And it's the sense you will get from all the private sector players. That's why I always say, I appreciate working with private sector, because if they don't want it, they will say no, and you start negotiating. Other than other people who will say yes, and they don't do it. So it's better and easier to work with black and white and no gray area. So we really appreciate to have a private sector that works like that. If we say we'll do it, let's do it. If we said no, then we know we are not going to do it. And I'm glad that the ones who said they will do it with private sector and then left alone, they are not in the room, because they would have been called to answer. But yes, I think though even them, they will find their way back to their promise one day. So my last set of questions goes to our two private sector representatives, which is Mr. Andrew Leroux, Montigny Investment CEO, and Mr. Alof Marias, who is the head of Department Engineering Services Project, Royal Eswatini Sugar. So I will ask one question, and then you would give me inputs. I think I can start from the left from Andrew. So here we understand that yesterday the Director Energy indicated that we need private sector to invest in short-term and long-term power generation plans. And please tell us about what you expect to be in place from government side, that is the regulator and the utility, to unlock the green energy investment in Eswatini, especially from the perspective of your entities. And also please explain to us about your roles as electricity customers and potential suppliers of electricity to the grid. What is the green energy transformation unlocking for you as business customers and as potential suppliers? Over to you, starting with Mr. Andrew.
Dr. Sakolo, thank you very much, and a very good day to everybody, and a special thank you to my colleagues here up front. Let's start with some good news. I think when you actually look at a presentation of what Eswatini has achieved over the last 10 to 15 years, I think we've done very well. And I think we can thank our ministry, we can thank EEC, and we can certainly thank Isira for the progress that's been made and the added urgency that we're seeing over the last 2 to 3 years, no doubt driven by various factors, and not least of which is what's happening in South Africa and what's happening with the status of our contract with Eskom. That's the good news. The bad news is that we are fast running out of time to put all of these plans into practice. And in a sense, talking about things is the easy bit. and actually putting rubber to the road is the hard bit, and we really are at that point now, which is why conferences such as this is so important, so that we can all get on the same page. What our CEO touched on around tariff cost reflectivity, I think is absolutely critical and is going to be one of the things that need to be unlocked in order for us to move forward. So what needs to be put in place? So, and speaking now as Montigny, what needs to be put in place is a very clear tariff methodology going forward and a very clear differentiation of the different types of renewable energy. As was touched on earlier, solar is going to become cheaper, PV is going to become cheaper, but it is not always reliable and it's not available all day long. At the end of the day, we need to have very reliable, non-negotiable baseload power. And there are very, very few guaranteed options for that, and one of those guaranteed options is biomass, either in the form of wood chips or in the form of bagasse, which my colleague will touch on. So what we need is very clear guidance around where in the pecking order does biomass fit in. It's extraordinarily capital intensive to set up biomass plants, and there are continuous costs. It's not like solar where you put a solar panel up and then the sun shines. Here you have to continually supply biomass into these processes. And the reality is biomass is expensive. It's not just a byproduct. It's expensive to handle, it's expensive to transport, but also the value of biomass is going up. We have got, as the forestry industry, we've got very good markets internationally for our biomass. So there is competition internationally for our biomass, and it needs to be worth our while in order for us to deploy that capital in Eswatini, so that we can get the benefit of electricity generation here. So there needs to be a good return on capital, and in order to achieve that, we need to have very good clarity around timelines and very good clarity around tariff structures. In terms of your second question, what does it mean for us? Well, number one is it does mean that the private sector has to work together. And that's not something that we always do. People talk about the private sector as if it's a single entity. It's not. It's many, many moving parts and lots of individuals and companies with their own agendas and everybody looking after their own self-interest. So in a sense, we have to set a baseline here to say, guys, we're all on this raft together, and either we're going to figure it out or we're all going to sink. But in the process of figuring it out, we have to address each company's individual niches and also address their fears, but also make it worth their while in order for them to invest. So certainly that for me is absolutely critical, is this ability to work together. And we need to provide an environment where we can work together, because traditionally we've got the Competition Commission. It's often frowned upon where companies work together because it can be seen as collusion, because what is the private sector getting out of this, and why are consumers paying for certain companies to get rich? We need to break that barrier to say, guys, how do we work together so that it's worthwhile for the companies, but also worthwhile for the consumer and worthwhile for the country? And we need to break that barrier down. It's also very worthwhile for companies because of market access. The reality of today is, in order for me to sell timber products internationally, or in order for the sugar industry to sell internationally, we have to use renewable energy in order to produce those products. Market access is becoming more expensive and more difficult for any products produced with fossil fuels. So we are highly incentivized in order to maintain our own business models to transition to renewable energy. It's good for us, it's socially good for us, it can even make good financial sense for us. But in a sense, it's absolutely critical because our markets depend on it. So this is something that we absolutely have to do. And then obviously, if the transition to using byproducts is sustainable, it makes our existing operations more sustainable. If there's a good market for my wood chips, it makes my plantations more sustainable. And I suspect it's the same for the sugar industry. And that allows us to spend more and more and more in having more sustainable plantations, because we know that we've got a guaranteed offtake for such a large percentage of our fiber. But I think bottom line, what's in it for us? I think keeping the lights on is what's in it for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will quickly switch to Mr. Olaf. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and all protocols observed. I think to add to what Andrew was saying is the private sector, specifically the large-scale biomass producers, we are all committed to the country as a whole. But in the same breath, we're also committed to keep the lights on. We need to make sure that our stakeholders also survive the process. We need to make our board are actually receiving what they are intending to, or what they would like to receive. In that, it's crucial for us to really understand what the real role is for biomass in this sector. So I'm going to, I think Andrew has alluded to all the points that's required on a more high level. But if you look at the biomass per se, at the role of the biomass sector, we are basically going to be responsible for supplying the base load into the country. And in terms of working together, we can't just do each one of us do our own thing. We need to be working together with EEC, with all government entities, in order to keep the lights on. We need to know when each one of us are actually requiring maintenance on their system and stuff like that. But we also need to realize, and without throwing numbers around, one can just go and download the latest IRENA report. It doesn't come cheap. Solar and wind, even though it's some of the cheapest resources, and Mr. Mukonta actually alluded to that as well, you need additional resources in order to make that power more or less variable, to get the quality of the power proper. And on top of that, you look at the capacity factor, the availability of source. Biomass typically sits in the order of 70, 80%. So that's a reliable baseload power. The benefit of solar and wind and those elements are actually that it reduces our reliance and stretch our fuel load in terms of the biomass. But to get that whole process going, it needs an absolute collaboration between all parties, between the private sector and between government. And as Andrew was saying, I mean, the last 10 years, a whole lot of systems and policies and stuff has been implemented. Initially, RS, back in 2010-11, we looked at pushing into the grid, but it was just not viable, purely from the fact that whole VAT issue actually would have meant that we would be subsidizing electricity pushing into the grid. And that's not for private business. We remain a private business. We need to make money as well. That's not viable. But as the things are actually changing towards the better, it opens up those opportunities. So there's still some small elements that need to be looked into. For instance, that the 80 megawatt RFP for a private company to go out and put up his hand and say, listen, we've got the potential to push or supply 30% of the grid's power. We can't just jump up and say, listen, here we are. We need the policies and systems in place in order to do such, in order to get the cheap finance. And that's where the crux of this whole thing is. If we don't get cheap finance, we're not going to get the cheap power that everybody believes a green power sector ought to be. It's all about the finance and the policies driving the finance. And as Mr. Chef also indicated, that's the policies need to be in place in order to unlock all those elements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olof. The panelists have unpacked, and to me it looks like we will get premium power from biomass, and we should be willing to pay that premium for the stability that we would otherwise not get from all the other sources. So I think we can still have, since I still remember that my time was taken or was borrowed, I can still borrow forward a bit of 10 or so minutes for a brief Q&A, which will then be followed by a short summary from my colleague. May I humbly request somebody to help me with a roving mic? I'll take just 2 or 3 questions. Yes, one over here.
I'd like to come back to the two last speakers. Biomass, baseload for the country, about 30% of installed capacity you can do. You referred to cheap capital. Can you highlight what is cheap for you? What are you looking at? Percentage-wise, where must it come from? What are you looking at?
At this stage, we can't really say what amount of it is cheap, but one also needs to understand external investment into the country. If we look at for instance, European money into the country, which arguably is cheaper, you need to balance that out with local investment. You can't just funding from overseas and just cut local investment out of the equation completely. So at the end of the day, it's going to be driven by what the levelized cost of energy is going to be. Effectively, so that will be driving the whole process to see what can be done to get the cheapest power at the lowest investment cost. And that's why all those policies will actually enable us to hopefully unlock a lower cost investment, either directly or via local investment institutions as well.
Are you currently competing with other renewables just on tariff, or are you also getting a bonus for your capacity factor for your installed capacity?
Well, that's probably more question to be asked to the regulator.
Because obviously if you're baseload, that should have a bonus.
Yeah. I think the bonus is actually more coming in the fact that you are able to overall reduce the price, the complete energy mix with solar and wind and biomass included. The more solar you can actually introduce, the cheaper the overall cost of electricity is going to be.
And then you're spreading your biomass more for baseload. Yeah.
Correctly, and by doing so, for instance, if we look at the biogas opportunity that we have, probably half of the existing biomass of the existing gas can be used or is available for the required biomass for large-scale power generation. The existing system in operation is actually to burn the cane fields to get rid of excess biomass in order to transport it or reduce the cost of transport. Now we need to invest additionally in mechanizing to separate the potential, and there's 30% of potential in that to introduce it to the factory as a biomass source, as fuel. And the surplus actually need to come from the plantation sector. And there it's a cost or matter of cost of transport. The more moist your wood chip is, the less energy you're actually transporting. So the higher the cost of fuel at mill gate is. The cost of fuel at factory gate, the milling sites remains the same, but the fuel cost transport or fuel transport cost element actually just shoots through the roof if it's too wet. But the flip side of the coin is also true. If they dry out too much, then it's too light. So it's a volumetric issue that we sit with. So in that, what will help as well is if one look at road transport regulations to enable us to transport a higher volume of fuel as well. So there's a number of elements to play into it. But I think to answer your question, the price would be dictated by the energy mix as a whole, and what we can get from in terms of financing, cheaper financing.
Yeah, thanks, Olaf, and thank you. That's a good question. Look, at the end of the day, pricing follows risk. So the more that we can take risk or moving parts out of this discussion, I think the more we can get a true picture of what pricing is required. So for example, if as Montigny we are buying capital items in euros or in dollars, and there's no ways to pass on that fluctuation in our pricing model, because perhaps the regulator or EEC says, no, we cannot have an element of dollar pricing in that. That's obviously a massive risk to us. The rand can move against the dollar by 10 to 15% a week. So the more we can take these variables, the more we can accurately price what we need to do. And the more variables there are, unfortunately, we're going to have to build in a risk premium. So even if we can borrow in rands, you can obviously tolerate a higher interest rate. If you borrow in dollars, then obviously you can only tolerate a low interest rate because there's a risk premium to currency fluctuations. And this is where this afternoon's discussion is so absolutely critical around the funding model. So again, if government can step in from a sovereign perspective in order to create that certainty to our lenders that it might be in dollars but priced in rands, or that there's a protection there in some way, that then gives the companies a certain flexibility to reduce our tariffs because the risk profile is lower.
I think maybe to add on the element of risk as well. The technology side of things, not the capital side of things. One can go to the eastern countries and you get maybe not that high quality of equipment, but at a very good price compared to the Western, the European countries, and that speaks to the potential lifespan of it, and then also in terms of the cost of equipment and at the end of the day, the tariff cost itself. Typically, the equipment coming from the East are generally less cost intensive, capital intensive, but price. So that element of risk.
Yeah, well, I was just saying, I know I'm just conscious of time, but when we come back, I'll probably kind of ask the CEO of Standard Bank, who's the earliest proponents of this migration we're talking about, and he's been looking at the funding structures ever since. Maybe just give him a chance to make a comment. Probably not now, because we have run out of time.
Oh, thank you. One last one. Very last. Okay, let's end with that two. Just two. The hands they rose at the same time, so I couldn't tell which one to choose and which one to drop. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Morning, afternoon. Jan Botha, Managing Director from Isella Farms. My question is just based on Mr. Chwala's comment that he made earlier, and I'm not sure if Mr. Mkonta can maybe answer this. The pilot project commencement is now in a phase where it's going. How long can we foresee these pilot projects going, and when can we expect it to stop to actually get to implementation stage of the private sector?
Thank you. And let me take the second one so that they can just answer collectively, and then we close the session.
Okay, I'll be short. Okay, my big concern is in terms of what you call a human resource. It's a huge project. It's a huge challenge. What strategies are in place to sort of educate and teach and whatever? People who will run the program and maintain it, because it's a long-term project, which will have to be implemented and rolled on by future generations. I'm not sure if my question is very clear.
Thank you very much. I think one of our panelists will find a way to provide a bit of clarity around that one. Let me first give Mr. Twala, and if you can just summarize them briefly, Mr. Twala, so that then I'll give my colleague 2 minutes to give us the summary.
Okay, thank you so much. I think the question, if we understood correctly, you were referring to the pilot projects that were mentioned under the presentation, the EEC presentation. I will request my colleague Abayo Mkonda to respond to that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mzwandile. Thank you very much, Program Director. The question is quite relevant as well, and it resonates with the other questions about planning and implementation. I think we have presented a clear timeline in the last slide in the presentation which Nosipo made. And the national rollout is scheduled to start in January 2023 to June 2023. And we believe that by that time we should have gathered enough information on the impact these will have on the grid. Thank you.
I think I'll respond on the question in terms of training. Training will be a knowledge-based transfer approach. If you look at what happened with Eskom, the mass exodus of knowledge has us in the position that we are in now. So it will definitely be happening over a number of years through a knowledge-based transfer process.
Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much for that. May I invite my colleague Mangaliso Mohammed to give us a brief summary of the discussions, and then we will close the session.
Thank you, Thabo. Good afternoon, all protocols observed. I'm going to be brief because I know we want to have our lunch. My job is just to give you a key message in terms of the discussion that we've had today. It's been an interesting one, and I think it's leaving us with a lot of things to think about, but as well things to do going forward. So from the ministry, it's been clear that we are dealing with a dynamic sector here, the energy or the power sector, but it's very key that we have these plans, but also to help us to be ahead of what's coming, we need these plans. And so what is key also is that we need the political will and support to implement the projects that we are thinking about here as we make this power transition in the economy. To help that as well, I think it has become very clear that we need coordination between the public and private sector so that you are all always aligned in terms of what's happening. From the regulator, capacity building is key, and you have indicated that it's an intrinsic part of the system, so you always have to update your skills so that as well you keep up with the advancements in the industry. And also you've indicated that the training needs to come with clear outcomes so that we are not just training for the sake of training, but we see tangible results in terms of improvements in implementation of projects in the economy that are enabled by regulation. Our regulation is liberal, we've got to understand that, and so hopefully we can see many projects being implemented so that then power can really stimulate growth in the economy. You also touched on an interesting discussion point around the tariffs to say that we do need to look at how we cost the different renewable technologies, because some can be cheap while others you do really need to take some time to think about ring fencing the renewable tariff so that then we don't drop those that are expensive, because at the end of the day, as you have indicated in the private sector, that biomass is expensive, but it does pose or stand a chance to provide us the base load that we need. Stability issues. I think stability, EEC indicated that it's something that we need to think about in our regulation, in our implementation of this embedded small-scale power generation, because without it, it can really disrupt operations within our national grid. And so I think our independent power producers, they really need to understand how the system operates and how they can position themselves to work in a manner that can create less disruptions in the system. IPPs also need to think about the type of investments that they're going to be making. Yes, some are going to be cheaper, some are going to be expensive, but at the end of the day, we need to think about cost effectiveness as well as reliability, so that then at the end of the day, we have IPPs connected to the grid, supplying us with reliable power that we can enjoy as consumers. The renewable energy transition is also unlocking new markets in terms of the products that we're going to be supplying to our export markets. So this is something we can ride on going forward to say that we are a sustainable economy. Our products come from renewable energies, and I think the EU, the US, and all the big markets will open up to that, and you'll see that you'll be making more money in the private sector. Sentiments from business, the business sector. CEO of Business Eswatini, you highlighted that we need to take note of the opportunities that we will be creating with this energy transition in terms of high quality jobs, especially within this green energy sector. That is going to be really a new sector of the economy that we will be driving forward. We need to move fast. We do not have time. But at the same time, we need to be cautious of what we are doing so that then we address all elements of the system. Migration to cost-reflective tariffs is one of the key things we also need to think about, so that then as we are migrating to this new system, this green system, we need to be clear about the tariff that is being paid by the commercial sector, as well as the tariff that can be paid by the domestic sector. The good news is that we have made progress coming along, and so at the same time we need to then move faster in implementing these projects that we are thinking about now. And the key messages that the private sector wants to hear from government, especially regulation, we need a clear tariff methodology so that as they are making their business plans, they are able to rank the technologies in terms of their cost and the tariff that is going to be afforded by the system as part of regulation. I think all private sector people, they need to make sure that they have good return on capital, and so the tariff that needs to be in place needs to address all of these issues. We also got to understand that the private sector is also complex. It's also dynamic in nature, so it also needs to come together and work in a coordinated manner. Mr. Olof, you indicated that you are committed as a private sector in the implementation of these projects, but you need to understand the role of biomass or the biomass sector as it stands to supply the baseload power that we need. And in that, it's part of the regulatory framework that ESERA and government needs to clearly stipulate, so that then you are able to make your projections going forward and also to package your investments in a manner that can be sustainable. Everything rests on cheap or affordable financing, and this is the next section after lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think now you see why I had to bully him to take the difficult part. Thank you. So may we give a big round of applause for our panelists for being such wonderful. And one big one for yourselves for being so cooperative. Thank you.
So much, Mr. Sakolo and the panelists. At this point in time, it's time for lunch. May I request us to go downstairs to the restaurant, and on your way out, please make sure that you collect a coupon so that you are able to get a drink and some refreshments down there. And can we please keep time? At 1:30, we should be back here. 1:30, we should be back here. Thank you. See you at 1:30.
you.